Hi all, welcome to Module 4. This week we're talking about culture and gender and how they relate to conflict. So there are two main ideas for us to work with in this module. First, gender and cultural identity shape our understandings of conflict. And this isn't an argument about biology, this is an argument about socialization and social construction of meaning. Because of socialization, we're all embedded in systems, right, that have specific cultural norms, and then we're socialized into those norms. How we're socialized and what we're surrounded by in our culture shape our conflict framing and our perception of what conflict is like. It shapes our understanding of how we should communicate in a conflict and what we can and should do, right? What options there even are for us to manage conflict. So when I'm talking about culture, and the way that culture is talked about in our materials for this module is very broadly construed. So we're not just meaning like nationality, but also broad cultural groups that are important to who you are. So there are different cultures even here within the US, and cultural identity can be about your heritage, your kind of racial background, your religion, your language, and so on. And culture is not just like what food you eat and what holidays you celebrate. Certainly that's part of it. But culture also provides us with deeply embedded habits, assumptions about communication, and beliefs about how our social world is organized. And those assumptions include what we think about conflict. So we're often not really that aware of our cultural identity if we're surrounded by people from the same cultural group. If we don't necessarily have reason to think about it because our kind of cultural norms and the socialization that go along with it, they're just like the air that's all around us. But we need to reflect on it because otherwise culture can seem just like something that someone else has, where we think of ourselves as normal. And that's just incorrect, right? Everybody is embedded in a cultural system. We all have culture of various sorts. So this kind of ethnocentric thinking can lead us to stereotype people from different cultural groups, blame them for being different from us, and it's a really dangerous way of thinking, especially if it's taken to an extreme, because it can lead us to fear or hate people we label as others, and that has clear implications for conflict. So it's important for us to think about how our way of seeing the world is rooted in our culture. And when I say our, I mean that broadly. I don't mean that like mine is exactly the same as yours, right? But for each of us, it's important for us to think about how our way of seeing the world is rooted in our culture. I know when I've traveled abroad, or even traveled within the US, I've become hyper aware of my own cultural assumptions because I find myself kind of out of my element. For example, I grew up in the western part of the United States. And when I was in high school, my family, we moved to Alabama in the southern part of the US. The way I talked, the way I dressed, everything about me kind of clearly marked myself as an outsider. And I had a weird accent. I didn't understand some of the words that people in my school thought were just normal communication. Also, the Southern culture in the US is much more high context than I was used to. So things have meaning even if they're not said explicitly. And that's just a norm. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, and I didn't understand that what I thought was just a normal way of communicating was seen as very rude, very abrupt and direct and impolite, right? So that's just a small example of how that can lead to sort of a conflict. As another example, two of my current friends here in Ohio are a couple who come from different cultural backgrounds. She's Italian and he's Japanese. They've both lived many different places and they've spent decades in the US. And there are many, many things about them that do not fit with kind of cultural stereotypes. But they do have extremely different ways of communicating between the two of them. She's very expressive, emotionally expressive, talks about her emotions, she talks with her hands and so on. He's very even keel, speaks very rationally, kind of calmly. So their ways of engaging in conflict are really different from each other. And my friends have developed ways of understanding each other's different communication styles and cultural expectations, and that works well for them. But I can easily imagine other people with these same cultural communication patterns that could have profound misunderstandings and lead to conflict, right? So I've talked about culture, but gender is similar, right? Every culture has norms related to gender, and these norms come through in our everyday discourse. Think about when you were growing up. What kind of messages did you hear about what boys and girls were supposed to be like? What did you see adults doing that were related to their gender roles? Were men and women two very separate kinds of people who did different jobs, led different lives, and had different ways of communicating? Did you have experience with people who didn't fit those stereotypes related to gender identity? And if so, what were they like? And how did people react to them? So even though as a society we are much more open now and we have a much broader and more fluid understanding of gender than we used to, and there's much more widespread support for people in the LGBTQ community, these discourses of masculinity and femininity are still very pervasive in our culture. And whether we like it or not, our gender identities are influenced by these discourses to some degree. And along with that influence come some expectations about communication and about conflict. And of course, gender and culture are also intertwined with power, which we talked about last week. Cultures have different assumptions about power relationships, and that can create challenges in intercultural situations. Also, in specific situations, certain kinds of people are more likely to be viewed as powerful and more likely to have access to resources and power structures. And power and gender and culture all intersect when we're talking about conflict in organizational settings. So all these things shape how we engage in conflict. So it's important to understand that power, gender, culture, and conflict are intertwined. So the second big idea for this module is that it is imperative that we develop better intercultural conflict competence. That's kind of a mouthful, but it has to do with not only being competent communicators in general, but being competent communicators interculturally, and also thinking about how that relates to conflict. So, as we live in a globalized society, we're surrounded by people from a variety of cultural backgrounds, and it's essential that we reflect on our own cultural assumptions and develop better intercultural competence. So in general terms, communication competence means communicating in a way that's both effective, that is, it accomplishes your goal, it's clear and gets messages across and achieves the understanding, right? It's effective in that sense, and it's appropriate. So it's viewed as okay for the situation and the people involved, right? Unlike me in Alabama, you're not being rude, you're being appropriate by understanding the norms of the situation and speaking in ways that make sense. In an intercultural context, adaptability is also really important. So to communicate across cultural lines, you need to recognize when to shift the way you're listening and talking to be a better fit for the people who you're talking with, to the situation and the context. So there's kind of three aspects of intercultural conflict competence, and you'll read about that in one of the readings. One is culture-sensitive knowledge. So that's knowledge of your own cultural expectations, as I was just talking about before, but also knowledge of other cultures. So educating yourself, learning about places and cultures that are different from your own. There's also mindfulness, is the second thing. Mindfulness means attending to your internal communication assumptions, cognitions, and emotions, and at the same time being attuned to other people's cultural assumptions, cognitions, and emotions. So culture-sensitive knowledge is more kind of broad. Mindfulness is like reflecting on yourself and noticing what's going on with other people and being sort of empathic, right? Constructive communication skills are things like listening, mindful reframing, de-escalation, code switching, translation, collaborative conflict management, things that we're going to get into a lot more depth in the second unit of our course. But for now, I encourage you to be mindful about your own communication patterns and assumptions and think about how those are related to your culture and your gender. I also encourage you to work on developing culture-sensitive knowledge, both for your own culture and other cultures that are part of the world that you inhabit. So that's it for now. I look forward to reading your reflections this week, and as always, I'm happy to answer questions, and I hope that you have a great time with this material.